It is time to finally make a video blog. I've been intending on doing this for ages now and putting it off and putting it off. Now, the original idea was going to be the press cubicle, so that would be covering a story each week that we didn't cover in the podcast. Now, since we haven't been doing a podcast very often, that kind of makes it less of a relevant idea, but I will still talk about just some random topic related to gaming that we may not necessarily cover in depth. I was originally going to talk about one thing that'll tie into tangentially and maybe go into after, but I'm going to address something that I want to speak more about, which is we have this topic, which I did post in a bit, but I want to elaborate. So this is Dragon's Crown Beyond the Boobies, because there's been some sort of controversy, I guess. The artwork in the game happens to have at least one hero with ridiculous sized breasts, and then a journalist decided to write a snarky comment on his blog about it, and now there's been some sort of backlash. So the question has become whether or not it was justified to make any sort of criticism, and whether this is some sort of political correctness gone haywire and overboard and all of that. And the thing is, there's a couple things that were wrong about this. One was that this was a very short, it's not like this was a big in-depth article that has like a whole bunch of background to it and is this big main front page thing. It was just a little paragraph being snarky about it. So there's that side of things where it seems like the backlash is the one actually trying to make something out of nothing. But the other is the inherent backlash that comes up on the internet where there's an attempt to have this self-righteousness against a straw man of self-righteousness. If you take the internet as an overall community, this sort of, if you were to lump everything together, what kind of group would you get? You do not get a population that is representative of the general population. You have a much more male-dominated medium. And the thing is about that is that you have your own prejudices that arise in that. So the internet culture is not an equal culture. It is biased, prejudiced against different groups if you actually pay attention to it. So what this happens to be is anything that goes against the grain there gets this big backlash. Oh, you're not trying to, for example, defend equality. You're a white knight. You're putting women on a pedestal, as opposed to actually promoting equality. The reason why that the idea of having ridiculous proportions and scantily clad women in video games is a problem is that it's a consistent trope. It is very rare to actually have a realistically portrayed woman as a prominent character in a video game. Now, Phantom Leo is arguing on the side of this. I'm not putting him in the same group as the self-righteous ones who are very dismissive about criticisms to the prejudices on the internet. But one thing that he's pointing out is that the industry right now is inundated with bald male space marines. That in itself, a bald male space marine is nothing offensive in any way. The problem is that, yes, the industry is dominated by bald male space marines. That's the archetype of the protagonist in a video game. You have this it's male, it's this marine who kills everything, and then the scantily clad women are there as accessories to that main male character. Ironically, though, in a archetype of the typical bald male space marine, Mass Effect actually does it right, where you can play as either. So that is a good example of proper design, of not making it about that. But some other things that come up in terms of uh, backlashes against this idea of political correctness is language, which is what I was going to talk about. So I'll try and tie it in. Uh, I've been playing a lot of Dota 2. Now, I had mentioned previously in podcasts when I had mentioned about Dota is the community is absolutely atrocious. The genre of game apparently is notorious unto itself for being a horrible group of people. Consider it along the same lines as Xbox Live. You have very negative connotations. You also have an idea of what kind of language they use. The thing is, if you try and levy any sort of criticism against that, what ends up happening is the idea of man up. Oh, you're just being offended. You don't have a right to not be offended. We should be able to say anything we want. Oh, these racial bigoted slurs don't actually mean these racist or homophobic things anymore. They're just words that we like to use as insults that just happen to be biased against the people we're always putting down, insulting, and making and just targeting as inferior. So the problem is that is the majority on the internet. That's the culture of the internet. So if you try and discuss this in a popular forum in that context, you're going to get way more backlash, and you're not going to have the kind of conversation you would have in a real world scenario. So if we bring this back in terms of the idea that we're not being fair in terms of the people involved, the artists in this case, do they have enough freedom? Well, consider it also in terms of, now this is, before I continue, this isn't, nobody's forcing anybody to do anything. This is simply criticism in the same way that if you critiqued a game, you could give it a 5 out of 10 and say it's kind of mediocre. Or you could say it's great, it's amazing. It's not legislative, it's not forcing somebody to do something. But if we look at some situation where we are forcing people to do things, the idea of affirmative action, for example, there's some elements that are frustrating in that it can be, well, if you had 2 equal candidates, now you're giving one an advantage. But that's just to make up for the inherent disadvantage that exists ahead of time in the culture. So, if nobody makes any sort of critique of the idea that we're continually catering the market of video games to the same group all the time, you're not going to get any change, or anything that is very different is going to be very niche. It's not going to be mainstream. So having some sort of suggestion, some sort of push from the people in a position to do so, to say this should really change, that's what's going to drive change, not sit back and hope for things to change. And in that, another thing that kind of seemed rather odd was Famleo suggesting that banning guns because you have killers is the wrong thing to do instead of protecting children or treating the mentally ill. Of course, treating the mentally ill isn't actually mutually exclusive to banning guns. But if you're in a situation, well, if you consider actual situations in the United States where Leo is from, if you're protecting children, like, this is one thing that comes up is suggesting, for example, to arm teachers with guns. That's not helping. I'm also not quite sure how it relates in terms of the actual topic at hand, because if you're going to try and say there's some alternative. What is the alternative here to suggesting that having the same tropes and skewed perceptions of heroes and skewed like levels of equality in terms of how you portray people, what's the alternative in this scenario? What is the treating the mentally ill in our scenario of we're having video games tailored to, teen males predominantly? Is it to suggest that it's not a problem? We can't control the feelings of other people. So in that regard, we can't really tell other people who don't play games because they're not actually marketed toward them to say, get over it. You can't really just get over it. You need to actually provide something that is catered to them properly. In the same kind of manner, if you look at games that are tailored to girls, not women, but necessarily, but you'll have games that are, here's your normal set of games, and then here's the girl game. So you'll have like games that would be perfectly fine in terms of any gender being good for them, and then you'll have this set of super pink fashion games that are just, that's not the way to approach it. And I don't think that the idea of it's too politically correct to have criticisms levied towards the same ridiculous kind of, let's have a hero, for example, that I pointed out in my post of a woman in a bikini top and thong fighting giant lizards. We know who this is marketed toward, and that's what the criticism is. It's that it's more of the same. And suggesting that, well, it's artistic license. Yeah, they can do whatever they want, but we can also call them out on it. This isn't someone expressing themselves in an incredible, brilliant artistic way. This is selling sex, simply put. And, well, as a business, that's fine. They can and should do whatever makes them money as long as it's morally reasonable, but we should call them out on it at the very least. I really don't buy that this is hampering creative license. You can do a hell of a lot of things that aren't bald space marines without it having to be the same old inverse armor trope for any women, and this can also apply in terms of anything other than, of course, the bald space marine, who is the typical archetype right now. You can do just about anything, just as in the real world, you can do tons of things that aren't sexist, racist, or bigoted.